morning the world shifted under my feet was bright and cloudless, the kind of Texas day that promised heat, shimmering on the driveways by noon. I stood by the trunk of my father's old Chrysler, clutching my battered duffel bag, watching my reflection in the dusty chrome. The house behind me, white siding, crooked porch rail, was already humming with anticipation. I could hear the tinny sound of my half-sister Maura's phone as she scrolled through vacation playlists, the clatter of suitcases being loaded, and the impatient bark of my stepmother Belva, reminding everyone not to forget their passports. I checked mine 3 times, heart fluttering with hope that this year I might finally belong. I'd ironed my best shorts, brushed my hair flat, packed my own snacks so I wouldn't be a burden. Maybe things would be different. Then the moment shattered. My father Eldrick emerged from the house, shoulders squared and jaw tight. He looked right through me as if I were fog on the windshield. "That wretch doesn't belong," he roared, voice splitting the morning open. Before I could process the words, he yanked my bag from my hand and dropped it on the curb. The car door slammed, rattling the windows. Maura stared at her phone, pretending she hadn't heard. Onyx, my half-brother, gazed out over the lawn, his face blank as stone. Belva's lips were pinched, so tight they'd lost all color. The engine revved, gravel spat beneath the tires, and they were gone just like that. I stood frozen, sunlight prickling my skin. Duffel bags slumped at my feet. A neighbor across the street adjusted her sun hat, turned her face away. Mr. Finch, out watering his hydrangeas, busied himself with the hose, avoiding my eyes. I waited the minutes, stretching into hours, sweat pooling between my shoulder blades. I told myself they'd come back, that this was some twisted lesson. But the sun slid toward the horizon, and the air turned gold and then blue, and still no one came. As dusk fell, I dragged my duffel to the bus stop, numb and invisible, replaying Grandma Adeline's voice in my mind. "You always have a place here, Mirene." But as darkness gathered and the porch lights blinked on behind locked doors, I began to wonder if anywhere was truly mine. That night, the city felt colder than I'd ever known, as if every scrap of warmth had been stripped away along with my place in the world. I wandered the blocks near home until my legs ached, my duffel digging a bruise into my shoulder, the strap already starting to fray. I ended up in the park off Sycamore, settling onto a splintered bench beneath a flickering street lamp. In my palm, I cupped the small worn keychain Grandma Adeline had given me when I was 10. Its enamel was chipped, the tiny letters faded, but it still read, "Family First." I pressed it against my lips, desperate to feel something familiar. The air was thick with the smell of cut grass and distant car exhaust. A pair of teenagers strolled by, casting quick, uncomfortable glances. Later, a jogger passed without seeing me at all. Each sound in the dark made my shoulders tense, but worse than the fear was the growing ache in my stomach and the sharp burn of shame that refused to fade. I tried calling Dad, then Belva, letting the phone ring until it went to voicemail. I called again, listening to my own voice crack on the line before silence swallowed me. I told myself if I could just make it until morning, maybe things would look different. When the cold grew unbearable, I pulled my knees to my chest and tried to sleep, cradling the keychain in my hand. At dawn, with dew soaking the hem of my shorts, I walked the 2 miles back to the only place that had ever felt like home. The porch steps creaked under my feet. I saw them before I even reached the door, 3 black trash bags tied and slumped against the rail. My clothes, my shoes, even the old picture of me and Grandma, the glass cracked. The front door glared with a new silver lock. Mrs. Cedra peeked from her window and called out, voice soft, offering a place to stay. I shook my head throat tight and dragged my bags beneath the awning, curling up small as the day began again. The days bled together, marked by empty bus rides and the harsh fluorescence of late-night diners, where I nursed watery coffee and pretended I belonged. Sometimes I slept on benches, sometimes in the corner booth, if the waitress was kind. But I never stopped thinking about that porch, the bags, the lock, the way my name no longer seemed to fit anywhere. One morning, sorting through my meager belongings, I found a battered manila folder buried beneath a tangle of old t-shirts and socks. My hands shook as I slid the papers free, expecting school forms, or maybe another bill I couldn't pay. But the words at the top made my breath catch, "Last Will and Testament of Adeline Zeller." I scanned the yellowed pages, heart-pounding. There it was in black ink, my name. A quarter of the house, Grandma's house, legally mine. I reread the paragraph again and again, the words swimming in my tired eyes. The house where I grew up, where my father and stepmother now lived so comfortably, was partly mine by right, yet I'd been thrown out like refuse. For a while, anger flared sharp, bright, wild. I thought about lawyers, about knocking on the door and demanding my place. But the memory of Dad's sneer, Belva's cold eyes, and the wall of silence from Onyx and Mora pressed the fight out of me. Alone 17 and sleeping rough, I had no one who would stand by me. I folded the will, slipped it back into the folder, and tucked it deep inside my bag. The years that followed were a blur of small apartments, low-wage jobs, and silent holidays. Whenever the property tax bill arrived, I scraped together what I could send a check and waited for some sign that things might change. Dad called me a parasite. Belva rolled her eyes when I showed up at Christmas. Still, I paid what was owed, clinging to the hope that honoring Grandma's words might one day bring me back home. The years moved like water over stone, wearing me down in slow, unremarkable ways. I worked closing shifts at grocery stores and diners, wiped tables until my hands cracked, and came home to the kind of apartments where the heat clanged all night and the neighbors fought through thin walls. I measured my life in pay stubs and eviction notices, always one step from slipping under. Holidays hurt the most. Every Thanksgiving and Christmas, I'd bake a pie from scratch apples when I could afford them, canned peaches when I couldn't. I'd stand on the familiar porch pie, trembling in my hands, waiting for someone to answer the bell. Sometimes it was Belva, hair perfect, smile sharp. She'd wave me in with a brisk "Mirene's here," everyone as if announcing a distant relative. Onyx and Mora would glance up from their phones, offer stiff nods, and return to their screens. Dad, if he noticed me at all, would grumble about the oven being crowded or the living room already full. I always left early, my cheeks burning with embarrassment, pie barely touched. On the drive home, I told myself I went for Grandma's sake, not theirs. Still, the ache stayed with me through January. All the while, the house on Elm Street grew grander. New shutters, a fresh coat of paint, a deck that wrapped around the yard, parties spilled onto the lawn, laughter music, glasses clinking late into the night. I watched it all from a distance, the outsider who paid the property tax each spring. It never once crossed their minds to thank me, and I never expected it. What kept me tethered, I'll never be sure. Maybe the stubborn loyalty I learned from Adeline, or maybe just a flicker of hope that things could change if I waited long enough. I let the world treat me as a ghost, clinging to my corner of the living until one day the shadows began to shift. At 31, after years of scraping by, I finally allowed myself to dream of something that belonged to me alone. I'd saved enough for a down payment on a small condo, nothing fancy but with sunlight in the mornings and a kitchen window that looked out onto a row of crepe myrtles. I sat across from the loan officer, hands clasped, tight, heart pounding as she scrolled through her screen. Her polite smile faded into a frown. "Your credit is maxed, Ms. Zeller. There's also a lien against your name. Home equity loans you've defaulted on." My mind reeled. I'd never borrowed a cent, never missed a bill. I asked for copies of the paperwork. When they arrived, I saw my name, my signature, or something close to it on page after page, granting permission for loans I never knew existed. There was Eldrick's handwriting, too bold and familiar, scrawled beside mine, as if this were all perfectly routine. Dates matched the renovations I'd seen from the curb, the new porch, the flashy SUV. the photos of Rome and Cancun on Maura's social feed. Fury and humiliation tangled in my chest. I drove straight to the house and walked through the open door. Eldrick was sprawled in his armchair TV, flickering with sports highlights. I dropped the stack of papers in his lap. He didn't even look surprised. "You should be grateful for what little you have," he sneered, shoving the papers aside. "Maybe think about why you got left behind." Belva barely looked up from her magazine. Onyx and Maura snickered, whispering to each other at the kitchen island. The house I'd helped save was theirs. The credit that ruined me had bought them years of comfort. I left before my rage turned into something louder. Clutching the evidence with shaking hands, my sense of worth collapsing and reforming as something sharper. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing the shadows couldn't keep swallowing me forever. I moved through my apartment in a fog of fury and resolve, each motion careful and deliberate. I pulled the battered folder from the bottom of my closet, spreading its contents across the kitchen table. The will-faded tax receipts, every bank statement and form I'd kept out of stubborn habit. I compared signatures, tracing the loops and jagged lines with my finger until I could spot the forgeries at a glance. Each new discovery made my hands tremble with indignation, but it was a cold, steady anger that drove me forward. There, on a small flash drive taped inside a greeting card, was the message I'd listened to on lonely nights. When I doubted myself, most Grandma Adeline's voice soft but unyielding. "Mirene, the house is yours. No matter what they say, it's always yours." I played it again, letting her words shore up the parts of me that still wanted to shrink. With everything in order, I made an appointment with Callista Rowe, a lawyer whose name I'd circled in the phone book months before but never dared to call. Callista was brisk, sharp-eyed, her handshake warm but businesslike. She scanned my evidence, her expression growing more resolute as she pieced together the theft. "You have a case, Mirene," she said, her voice like a lifeline, "and you have more power here than you realize." Under her guidance, we filed the injunctions and notified the court. Callista worked quickly, quietly, freezing all transactions tied to the house and alerting the bank. Within days, the world that Eldrick and Belva had built on borrowed money and my stolen credit began to tilt. Bank accounts were locked. The pending sale of the house canceled their access to easy cash, suddenly severed. I waited in the quiet, my resolve hardening as I pictured the first cracks spreading through their perfect facade, and I knew the reckoning was only beginning. Word of the lawsuit spread faster than wildfire. Suddenly, every family gathering, church, potluck, and neighborhood chat revolved around my supposed madness and greed. My phone lit up with messages from distant cousins and former friends, some demanding explanations, most offering nothing but silence. Even Mrs. Cedra stopped waving when she watered her roses. I told myself I didn't care, but every time I passed a cluster of whispering neighbors, a knot tightened in my chest. When the court date arrived, I walked into the courthouse with Callista at my side, the weight of years pressing on my shoulders, but my head held high. Inside, I saw Eldrick and Belva, seated at the defense table. Belva's mouth set in a thin, trembling line, Eldrick's jaw jutting in false confidence. My siblings sat behind them, arms crossed, refusing to meet my gaze. The proceedings moved quickly. Callista spoke with measured clarity, laying out the pattern of fraud and deception. She submitted the will, highlighted with my name and Adeline's intent. She produced bank statements, notarized receipts, tax records, each one another crack in their story. Then came the audio files first, Grandma's gentle message, and then after a hush, fell over the room the recording that changed everything. Eldrick's voice clear and unrepentant. She was too naive to notice the papers we switched. Once renovations were done, it was ours. The gasp that swept through the courtroom was immediate and final. I watched as Belva's face drained of color as Eldrick's bravado evaporated, replaced by a stunned, desperate anger. Relatives who'd scoffed at me turned away ashamed. The judge's verdict came: swift ownership, restored charges, recommended an order to repay what they had stolen. When I stepped outside, the sunlight felt different. Solid earned. No one looked me in the eye as I left the courthouse, but for the first time I felt seen. I walked away from that building with my shoulders back, ready for whatever waited beyond the doors. The news spread quickly first, whispers, then stares, then an uneasy quiet as people realized the Zellers' world had collapsed. The house was mine, the accounts frozen, and the last of their borrowed luxury vanished like a mirage. I watched through the kitchen window as a moving truck pulled away, leaving Eldrick, Belva, Onyx, and Mora standing in the driveway, their suitcases slumped at their feet. For a moment I saw a flash of the old pride in Eldrick's eyes, but it faded as quickly as it came, replaced by exhaustion and something that looked almost like fear. They came to the door together, shoulders hunched and voices low. Belva was the first to speak, her carefully practiced composure finally slipping. "Mirene, please. We have nowhere else." Onyx and Mora, who once called me a burden, stood behind her, their faces stripped of any pretense. "We're sorry," Mora whispered, barely audible. We didn't know." I looked at Eldrick, waiting for the inevitable storm, but instead he lowered himself to his knees on the porch, head bowed. "I was wrong, Mirene," he said, each word catching in his throat. "You were always family. I see that now. Please, have mercy." The reversal was so complete, so impossible. I felt the old anger rise up inside me, sharp, hot, righteous. Years of silence, insults, loneliness, and longing pressed close. I wanted to turn away, to slam the door, to let them taste the cold that had shaped me. But I stood in the entryway, watching them shiver beneath the gathering dusk, their pride stripped away. I said nothing, letting the moment stretch, letting them feel the weight of what they had done. Only when the sun slipped low behind the rooftops did I finally step aside and let them in my mind, already sorting the new boundaries that would soon become the rules of my house. For the first time in my life, the house truly felt like mine. My family slept under its roof by my invitation alone, and the rules were no longer theirs to write. I made it clear from the start: no lies, no schemes, no crossing the boundaries I laid down. I kept the finances under my sole control, changed the passwords, and locked away every document that mattered. Belva's voice, once sharp and commanding, became tentative when she asked permission for even the smallest things. Onyx and Mora moved softly through the rooms, unmoored, struggling to accept chores and meals made without the trappings of comfort they once took for granted. I watched them adjust to the rhythms of humility, saw their anger replaced by something quieter and heavier. Sometimes in the quiet moments before dawn, I'd hear them talking softly, regret winding through their words. There were no apologies for the years they'd taken from me, but I no longer waited for one. I made my own coffee in the mornings and sat by the window, sunlight spilling across the table, and for the first time I felt a kind of peace settling inside me. Therapy became my anchor, helping me sift through the old pain and learn how to protect the fragile sense of self I was rebuilding. I reached out to old acquaintances and let new friendships blossom, inviting laughter and warmth into the rooms that had so long echoed with silence. Slowly I began to understand the shape of a family that could be chosen rather than inherited, a family built on respect, honesty, and care, not blood alone. The ache of betrayal still lingered, surfacing in dreams and on gray afternoons, but it no longer ruled my life. I was learning day by day to hold the past gently and let it inform the future instead of dictating it. By the time spring arrived, the air in the house had shifted, and I knew it was nearly time to visit Adeline's grave. The day was gentle, the sky wide and soft when I drove out to the cemetery with a single white lily resting on the seat beside me. The grass was freshly cut, sunlight dappling between the headstones, and a breeze carried the smell of new leaves and damp earth. I knelt at Adeline's grave, brushing a bit of dust from her name with my fingertips. My throat ached with all I wished she could see the girl I was, the woman I'd become, the house that stood waiting for me now. I placed the lily at the base of the stone and let my hand linger there. I kept your promise. I made it home. The words came quiet, but the truth of them warmed me all the way through. For a long moment, I sat in silence, letting my memories settle, letting grief and gratitude exist side by side. I thought of the years I'd spent chasing scraps of affection, the battles I'd fought for a place at the table, and the strange, bittersweet relief of finally understanding that not all families can be saved. Some losses had carved deep hollows inside me, but in their place something new had begun to grow. Later in the kitchen of the house that was now truly mine, I opened the windows wide and let the spring air sweep in, carrying away the heaviness that once haunted every corner. I cooked a meal simple, fragrant enough to share, and set the table for new friends who laughed easily, their voices bright and honest. The rooms felt lighter, fuller, each echo replaced by the gentle rhythm of belonging. As evening fell, I sat at the kitchen table, fingers curled around a mug of coffee, watching the last light spill over the yard. I thought about all the times I'd been told to keep quiet, to disappear, to make myself small. I thought about the power in choosing every day to take up space anyway. The question came unbidden, lingering in the hush. Have you ever been erased by your own family? When you reclaim your voice, what will you do with it? I closed my eyes and let the answer fill the room, quiet and certain.